Welcome to Michigan's WW1 Centennial News Report for March 2017, Statistics of the World War. I'm your host, Dennis Skupinski. During this program, we're going to take a statistical look at the World War. You will see the enormous task that the United States government faced when executing this war. The State Report. On March 16, 2017, State Senator Rebecca Warren introduced Senate Bill 248, which is for the creation of the WW1 Centennial Commission. Just a reminder, if you go to WW1cc.org and look up Michigan, you'll be able to keep in touch with what's going on with Michigan during the World War I Centennial. A century ago, March 1917. On March 1st, the U.S. government releases the plain text version of the Zimmerman Telegram. The Zimmerman Telegram was a secret diplomatic communication issued by the German Foreign Office in January 1917 that proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico in the event that the United States entered World War I against Germany. On March 5, 1917, United States President Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated for a second term. March 8, 1917, the February Revolution begins in earnest with protests celebrating International Women's Day and riots in St. Petersburg over food rations and the conduct of the war. March 11, 1917, British forces occupy Baghdad, the capital of Mesopotamia, after Turkish forces evacuate. March 15, 1917, Nicholas II, the last Russian Tsar, abdicates and nominates his brother, Grand Duke Michael, to become Tsar. The next day, March 16th, Grand Duke Michael declines the Russian throne. On March 20th, 1917, after the sinking of 3 more American merchant ships, President Wilson meets with his cabinet, who agree that war is inevitable. On March 21st, 1917, Loretta Walsh becomes the U.S. Navy's first female petty officer. On March 22, 1917, the United States is the first nation to recognize the new government of Russia. About 4 million men served in the Army of the United States during the World War, April 6, 1917 to November 11, 1918. The total number of men serving in the armed forces of the country, including the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and other services, amounted to 4,800,000. It is almost true that among each 100 American citizens, 5 took up arms in defense of the country. During the Civil War, 2,400,000 men served in the Northern armies or in the Navy. In that struggle, 10 in each 100 inhabitants of the northern states served as soldiers or sailors. The American effort in the war with Germany may be compared to that of the northern states in the Civil War by noting that in the present war we raised twice as many men in actual numbers, but that in proportion to the population we raised only half as many. This graph is a comparison between the American Expeditionary Forces and the British Expeditionary Forces. Both countries devoted their major efforts to building up and maintaining their armies in France. The results are set forth in Diagram 1, which shows the strength of 2 forces at different dates. This diagram shows the thousands of soldiers in the American Army on the 1st of each month. In the white area is the United States and its possessions. In the black area is the American Expeditionary Forces in France. When the United States declared war on April 6, 1917, there were only 200,000 men in the Army. Two-thirds of these were regulars, and one-third were National Guardsmen who were called into federal service for duty along the Mexican border. When the war ended, this force had been increased to 20 times its size, and 4 million men had served. The total male population of the country in 1917 was 54 million. During the war, some 26 million of them, or nearly half of all, were either registered under the Selective Service Act or were serving in the Army and Navy without being registered. This chart shows the percentage of the male population who were included in each of the registrations and the proportion who were not registered. The columns and figure of this diagram illustrate the manner in which men came into the service. In the fall of 1917, the first half-million came in rapidly. During the winter, the accessions were relatively few, and those that did come in were largely used as replacements for special services. In the spring of 1918 came the German drive, and with it, urgent calls from France for unlimited numbers of men. This map shows the percent of drafted men passing physical examinations by states. Analysis of the records of physical examinations show that country boys made better records than those from the cities, the white registrants better than the colored, the native born better than the alien birth. These differences are so considerable that 100,000 country boys would furnish for the military service 4,790 more soldiers than an equal number of city boys. Similarly, 100,000 whites would furnish 1,240 more soldiers than would an equal number of colored. Finally, 100,000 native born would yield 3,500 more soldiers than would a like number of foreign born. The importance of these differences may be appreciated by noting that 3,500 men is equivalent to an infantry regiment at full strength. This diagram shows the sources of commissioned officers. There were 200,000 Army officers. Of every 6 officers, 1 had previously military training with troops. 3 were graduates of officer training camps. 2 came directly from civilian life. This diagram shows the soldiers furnished by each state. As you can see, Michigan is ranked number 5 with 135,485 soldiers, 3.61% of the Army. The average American soldier went to France, received 6 months of training in this country before he sailed. After he landed overseas, he had 2 months of training before entering the battle line. The part of the battle line that he entered was in a quiet sector, and here he remained for a month before going into an active sector and taking part in hard fighting. This map of the United States shows the training camps for the Army, the National Guard, and the National Army. The regular Army and the National Guard trained in the white-colored circles, and the National Army or draftees trained at the dark-colored circles. During the 19 months of our participation in the World War, 2 million Americans were carried to France. 500,000 of them went in the first 13 months and 1.5 million in the last 6 months. Within the first few weeks of our entrance into the war, we began, at the earnest request of our co-belligerents, to ship troops overseas. At first, the movement was not rapid. We had only a few American and British troop ships chartered directly from their owners. During the early winter, as former German liners came into service, embarkations increased to the rate of nearly 50,000 per month. By the end of 1917, we reached a total of 194,000. This first chart shows men sailing each month to France and in November of 1918 back to the United States. This chart shows a transatlantic fleet in thousands of deadweight tons. The left side is troop movement and the right side is cargo. This map shows the deadweight tons of American Army shipping secured from different countries. This map shows troops sailing from American ports and landing in France and England. There were 4 Canadian ports, Quebec, Montreal, St. John's, and Halifax, and 6 American ports, Portland, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York. The largest was New York. This diagram shows American troops carried by ships of each nation. American 45%, British 49%, Italy, France, and Russia made up the other 6%. This chart shows in thousands of short tons the tons of Army cargo shipped to France each month. A short ton is defined as 2,000 pounds, while a long ton is 2,240 pounds. This shows the tons of cargo shipped to each Army Supply Service by April 30th, 1919 in short tons. And this chart just shows the average days required to convert a cargo ship to a troop transport. The greatest troop carrier among all the ships was the USS Leviathan, which carried 12,000 men, or equivalent of a German division, to France every month. She was a German ship Vaterland, which was seized by the United States when the United States entered the war, April 6, 1917. In the spring of 1917, there were 4 million young men in the United States who were about to become soldiers. Before they entered the Army, as well as when they were in it, these men consumed such ordinary necessities of life as food, coats, trousers, socks, shoes, and blankets. These simple facts led directly to the mistaken conclusion that the problem of supplying the necessities of life for soldiers in the Army was the comparatively simple one of diverting into the camps substantially the same amounts of food and clothing as these young men would have used in their homes if there had been no war. This chart shows the total American production for 4 articles compared with Army purchases. Figures are in millions. This map of France shows seaports, storage points, and supply lines of the American Army in France. This diagram shows the motor truck tonnage needed and that was available in the American Expeditionary Forces in France. This shows the American telephone and telegraph lines in France, England, and Germany. Basically, the communications infrastructure for the AEF. This map of the United States shows construction projects for the Army in the United States. There were 541 construction projects, average cost $1.5 million. This chart further breaks down the construction costs of projects in the United States. The National Army, or Drafty Army, took up a total of 24% of all the dollars used by the Army. This map of France shows the construction projects of the American Expeditionary Force in France. This graph shows the day's supply of Army rations on hand in the American Expeditionary Force each month. The first time they had over 45 days was in April of 1918. The quartermaster during the last 6 months of the war found out that in heavy fighting from June to November 1918, the average enlisted person needed every 5 months a slicker or an overcoat, blanket, flannel shirt, and breeches every 2 months, a coat every 79 days, shoes and puttees every 51 days, drawers and undershirt every 34 days, woolen socks every 23 days. During the years immediately preceding our entrance into the World War, there was much discussion in the War Department, as well as the country at large, of the need for increased military preparedness. The best military and civilian opinion was agreed that the Army would have to be called into service would be about 500,000 young men. In these reports, attention was called to the fact that while our available resources in trained men, airplanes, and machine guns was entirely inadequate, our reserve stocks of rifles and small arms ammunition was sufficient for even a larger army than 500,000 suggested. The Springfields were first issued to the regular Army and the National Guard's divisions that were first organized. In addition to these rifles, we also had a stock of some 200,000 Craig Jorgensen rifles that had been stored for an emergency. In addition, there was also efforts made to speed up the manufacturing of new Springfields. Even with increased manufacturing, we could only manufacture 1,000 Springfields a day. Several companies in the United States were manufacturing rifles for the British government. It was called the Model 17. They converted the chambers to the U.S. ammunition so it could fire the same round as the Springfield. This made up the shortfall for the U.S. Army. The earliest needs of our troops in France were met by French machine guns, the Hotchkiss, and the Chauchat automatic rifles. After July 1st, divisions embarking from the United States were equipped with U.S. Browning machine guns, both heavy and light. Browning machine guns were not used in combat until after September 1918, until they had sufficient quantities. General Pershing was fearful that the Germans might find out about this superior machine gun. The entire number of American machine guns produced to the end of 1918 was 227,000. The United States declared war in April of 1917. There were 544 3-inch field pieces. Each division required 50 3-inch field pieces, so there was enough for 11 divisions. The initial plans for the U.S. Army called for the formation of 42 divisions, which would require 2,100 3-inch field pieces. In addition, these divisions would require for active operations in France, repair shop reserves, replacement reserves, and a stream of guns in transit that would increase their initial requirements to 3,200. To keep this army going, it would require production of about 100 guns per month, but to get it going in a reasonable length of time would require production capacity of 300 to 400 guns per month. How was the United States going to make up the shortfall? In June of 1917, a decision was made. We would equip our active forces with French artillery. U.S. manufactured of artillery would be used for training purposes, and in return for French artillery, we would supply them with the necessary raw materials such as steel, copper, and other materials to manufacture their guns. This graph shows the complete units of artillery made in the United States, the total production at the end of each month. Production started in January of 1918 and ran until April of 1919. This graph shows the thousands of completed rounds of American artillery produced during each month, starting from December 1917 to December 1918. And this graph shows the tons of toxic gases manufactured each month, starting in January of 1918, running until November of 1918. After the declaration of war, the French government suggested that the United States send over 4,500 men for aviation training. This way they could maintain air superiority over the Germans. Training would be divided into 3 stages. Elementary and advanced training would be done in the United States, while final training would be done in Europe. This graph shows the number of flying officers in the Army each month, starting in April 1917 and ending in November 1918. This graph shows the production of training planes and engines for each month of the war. This graph shows the production of service planes for the U.S. Army. The U.S. did not start producing planes until February of 1918. The top number is from U.S. sources, the bottom number is from foreign sources. Notice in November 1918, they are about equal. This graph shows the production of service engines for each month during the war. Notice by November 1918, U.S. production methods clearly outproducing foreign sources. This graph shows the production and shipment overseas of observation balloons. This graph shows the breakdown of American air squadrons during the war. Notice it did not start until April of 1918 and is broken down into pursuit, observation, and bombing. This graph shows the number of service planes that were sent to the advance zone during each month of the war. Notice November 1918, the United States is sending over 600 planes to the advance zone. Two out of every 3 American soldiers who reached France took part in battle. Of the 42 divisions that reached France, 29 took an active part in combat services, while the others were used for replacements or the ones just arriving in the last months of hostilities. American combat divisions were in battle for 200 days, from April 25, 1918 till November 11, 1918. This graph shows the kilometers of front line held by each army, American at the top, British below, French, and finally at the bottom is Belgium. This data is for the American Meuse-Argonne battle, which took place from September 26 until November 11th and was America's largest contribution to the war. This graph shows the kilometers advanced against the enemy by each division. The 77th has the most with 71.5 kilometers, followed by the 2nd with 60. This graph shows the number of days each division spent in quiet and active sectors during the war. The leading one was the 1st Division with 127 days in a quiet section and 93 days in an active section. This graph shows the number of German prisoners captured by each division. This graph shows by each division the number of battle deaths and also the number of wounded and total casualties. Of every 100 American soldiers and sailors that took part in the war with Germany, 2 were killed or died of diseases. The Northern Army during the Civil War, that number was 10. Among other great nations in the war, it was between 20 and 25. This data shows the battle deaths in Army during World War I from 1914 to 1918. This chart shows battle deaths by week during the war. Notice Cantigny, Chateau Thierry, and America's largest operation, the Meuse-Argonne. This diagram shows battle deaths among 1,000 officers and men who reached France, broken down by the branch of service. Infantry and machine gun corps were the largest. This pie chart is a breakdown of American deaths. 32% or 35,509 died in the United States, while 68% or 76,699 died in the American Expeditionary Force in France. This pie chart breaks down how the people died. Battle casualties were 43%, disease was 51%, and other was 6%. This diagram shows the difference between disease and battle deaths during 4 United States wars. As you can see, during World War I, battle deaths increased, but the number of people dying from disease decreased tremendously. During the 25-month period from April 1917 through April 1919, the cost of war for the United States was more than $1 million an hour. Treasury disbursements during this period should have been $1,650 million. Instead, it was over $23.5 billion. This pie chart shows how each dollar for the U.S. Army is spent. 44 cents went to the quartermaster for supplies, 29 cents went to ordnance for weapons, and 13 cents went for pay. This graph shows the cost per day of the government and the Army. Notice from April 1917 to June 1917 versus July 1918 to April 1919. This data shows the total direct cost of war, which is $186 billion. 1/3 was spent by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, while the other 2/3 were spent by the United States and its allies. The highest spending country was Germany at $39 billion. The second was Great Britain at $38 billion. This chart shows the number of battle airplanes per 100,000 men broken down by different countries: French, British, Germany, and America. This chart shows in billions of dollars the estimated pre-war national wealth, pre-war national debt, and also post-war national debt of 5 nations.
What is the lady from the folks are singing around the tree, singing around the tree, everyone you meet. What is the latest melody that causes young idea, from the seeking to secret and I'll whisper in your ear, and the from Armentières, hallelujah. Mademoiselle from Armentières, save to you. Sing it with all your heart and soul and see everyone right up the pole. Mademoiselle from Standing across from Glasgow town, he put on his kilts one day, down with a blinding spray, merry and bright and gay. Out of the prom he strolled along.